Welcome back. Well, two polls published in the last week have highlighted which parties appear to be gaining and which parties appear to be losing in terms of public support. However, the organisation My Vote Counts has now been looking at whether our political parties are practicing democracy within. In other words, do their own members have a voice? The author of the research, a senior researcher at My Vote Counts, is Bregman. Joel, good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. It's a massive subject. We have many different political parties. Many of them want different things. They manage themselves in different ways. How do you assess if they're internally democratic?
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me. So it is quite a complex exercise, and it's true, no party is exactly like another party. But there are, within this concept of intra-party democracy, there are some key components that one can look at to try and assess how a party is faring in terms of how internally democratic it is. And in the literature that we've been looking at, the main issues around intra-party democracy is around leadership and candidate selection, and around policy development, and specifically to what extent does membership, does ordinary people at branch level have a say in determining the direction of the organization. The first part of our research was more based on the theory. In the next few months, we're going to actually be looking specifically at our parties and conducting more research in that sense.
The ANC probably still sets the tone for most of our politics, whether the opposition parties like that or not. And it has a whole lot of internal structures. We talk about them, all the time. We've seen so many provincial and regional conferences this year. Does it also have democratic weaknesses, despite what I think started out as a deliberate attempt to be internally democratic?
So just to make it clear, we're not saying that political parties aren't democratic or that they aren't practicing democracy internally. The issue is that they aren't always sufficiently democratic. So with the ANC, we actually know more about them compared to most other political parties. And some of their practices around how leadership is determined, they actually do have quite good levels of democracy. But then there are other areas which we think sort of leave a lot to be desired still. Issues around accountability, transparency, the way that, for example, disciplinary measures are instituted within the party, and the ability of members to actually drive, to drive policy. So like I said, we're still going to be looking further into this, but just from the outset, our contention is that we're not saying that there isn't democracy within the parties, but that it's something which needs to be nurtured and improved going forward.
So, different political parties also have different structures, but they all kind of have the same thing. They have, a national leadership, a provincial leadership, sometimes they have a region, and then they have a branch. And you can't really get away from that structure. Does structure determine whether a party is democratic, or is there an element of culture, whether individual members are listened to, whether leaders themselves feel accountable to members or not?
That's very central to the work we've been doing. So, like you said, because of the nature of parties, the structures, the somewhat hierarchical approach that they need to develop, especially for larger parties across countries where they could have, more than 1 million members, as is the case of the ANC. Our position is that it is more around the culture, more around the practices that are learned within the party. If we see parties as spaces where our political leaders come to learn their trade and to see how democracy is done, that's very much related to the culture that's inculcated within the parties.
I think that people, as voters, we can underestimate how difficult it is to build a party, to make it democratic, because by making a political party democratic, if you're a party leader, you're almost automatically opening yourself up to being the sort of victim of that democracy. Is it a lot harder than it looks?
It absolutely is, but it's something which we shouldn't shy away from because it is difficult. And one of the main reasons why we think intra-party democracy is something that, as a country, we need to be working on is that the more democracy you have within your political parties, then that filters over into the political system more generally.
What happens if a party is not internally democratic and it becomes the governing party? What happens to our politics?
Well, that's a very dangerous sort of hypothetical situation that could happen. If a governing party, is highly autocratic, where there isn't proper discussion around around policies or around decision making, and the nature and the culture is very much to impose positions on the public. I mean, it really is problematic. I think a really good example from a few years ago is when, despite massive amounts of evidence, ANC MPs in Parliament kept on defending former President Zuma. And we often speak about intra-party democracy in quite conceptual and theoretical terms, but the impact can actually be very real.
Joel Bregman, thank you. Senior researcher at My Vote Counts. Do appreciate the time.